from love letters collected from the wreckage all the way to the many examples of just how unprepared for disaster everyone really was. Here are the top 10 shocking moments from the Titanic kept secret. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the rich remains. When we think of the story of the Titanic, we of course think of the sinking of the ship, we talk about how the survivors were saved, and then of course we think of the catastrophic loss of life. Many people don't really stop to ask, what happened with all of those who passed in the tragedy, however? More than 1,500 passed away in the sinking of the Titanic, and only 337 bodies were pulled out of the water. A scholar named Jess Beer has recently examined what was done with those bodies, and through this research they have come to realize that whether or not these people got identified and what happened to their remains in the end all depended on their class and economic standing in life. About 1/3 of the recovered bodies ended up being returned to sea because the rescuers didn't think that they would get any sort of life insurance payout from the families of those who had passed and who were of a lower economic standing. For any bodies to be preserved for land burial, the remains had to be easily identifiable, and they needed to have a quote economic value even after death with a high social or economic worth. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Titanic Radio. This is a piece of the ship that has not yet been recovered, but it's the focus of much debate on whether or not it should be retrieved from the wreckage. Known in 1912 as the Marconi wireless telegraph machine, the radio on the Titanic sent distress calls to nearby ships that ended up saving the lives of 700 people in lifeboats. Despite how many people died in the Titanic tragedy, there were debates about whether or not to retrieve the artifact because of the fact that there might still be human remains located in the same area as the radio is. Lawyers have argued against the recovery of the radio because the dive plan did not include the prospect of there being human remains located down there. It also was argued because in order to retrieve it, they would need to cut into the ship's radio compartment, which was strongly opposed by preservation advocates. As of right now, it appears as though the dive to retrieve the radio will still occur, but in the end the pandemic delayed things quite a bit, so at this point it isn't clear exactly when. This radio would be a very valuable artifact, but it would also hold a really eerie tale of exactly when and how the radio was used during the final moments of the Titanic. In our number 8 spot today, we have the heads up. I'm not sure why, but for actual years I thought that on the day of the Titanic sinking, the iceberg they hit just kind of came out of nowhere and surprised them, so imagine my surprise when I found out that that wasn't true even in the slightest. Turns out the entire thing absolutely could have been avoided. The crew had received 6 warnings about the iceberg before the collision. While the first few warnings were received by the captain, not all of them were, and it's not totally clear why. Although the crew knew about the icy conditions of the water, they didn't slow down much, which some have called a reckless decision, but apparently this actually was standard practice at the time, so I suppose you can't really blame them. The final warning, however, was received from a ship that had halted for the night due to an ice field a few miles away, and when the message was being relayed to the captain, he cut it off and said to shut up as he was working Cape Race. In our number 7 spot today, we have a love letter. Richard Geddes was a cabin attendant on the Titanic who wrote a love letter to his wife while aboard, but unfortunately she would never go on to receive it. The letter was written on the original Titanic stationery, and it even had its original white star line envelope when it was found. While this story in itself is of course extremely sad, and again one of those reminders of the human side of those who were in this incident, this letter also contained something else besides utterings and confessions of love. It also featured a description that Richard wrote for his wife of a near collision that the Titanic had with the SS City of New York, obviously prior to this terrible iceberg incident. There were people who had witnessed this near collision and believed that it was a bad omen for the Titanic. In our number 6 spot today, we have the emergency systems. The time from the point where the ship actually hit the iceberg until the first lifeboats were launched was an entire hour. That is way too long when it is an emergency of this magnitude, which obviously leaves us wondering why. Well, as it turns out, a lot of people thought that the alarm bells were actually just a drill and they stayed inside where it was warm. This is already terrible, but what's even worse is that for the people who didn't think it was a drill, they had absolutely no idea where to go or what to do in the case of an emergency. They had never done any lifeboat drills, so everyone was just panicking with nowhere to go. Due to this lifeboat delay, there wasn't enough time to launch all of the remaining lifeboats successfully. quickly. There were even 2 boats that never got launched at all. That is obviously terrible because there are so many people who potentially could have been saved had this delay never happened. I also just can't imagine how frightening it would have been to be in the middle of that emergency with absolutely no direction at all. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Portholes. Since the Titanic sunk, people have been trying to figure out exactly how this unsinkable ship sank and how it sank so quickly. A recent study may have found a previously undiscussed scenario that likely contributed to the speed of the sinking ship greatly. On that fateful day, of course, the Titanic had grinded to a halt, and at that point, the passengers had no idea why, like I just mentioned. This led to many of them opening the portholes in the ship to get a look out in case they could see anything that would be stopping them from continuing on their journey. Many of those people who opened the portholes didn't close them after, and with every open porthole that went underwater, it is estimated that it doubled the size of the damage to the ship. It is possible that these open windows may have caused the ship to sink at double the rate it would have had those windows have been closed. Of course, this is not to blame the passengers, however, as this tragedy is certainly not their fault. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Telegraph. Okay, so you know how people often explain that perhaps many more people would have been saved or could have been saved from the Titanic wreck if the nearby SS California had their telegraph operator awake when the distress call was sent? For the man who went to sleep, that's a heavy burden to bear for the rest of your life, but a recent study suggests that even if he was awake, there likely wouldn't have been anything that he could have done. Firstly, there wasn't any rule stating that this guy needed to be awake for 24 hours to man the telegraph machine, so right there, he is off the hook. This is not his fault. This study, however, suggests that even if he was awake and the ship received the distress call, the ice around the Titanic was so thick that they likely wouldn't have been able to get through to save the passengers either way. Turns out this disaster really just had the perfect recipe for tragedy. In our number 3 spot today, we have true love. 2 of the first-class passengers who were on the ship were the elderly couple Isidore and Ida Stratus. When the ship started to sink and lifeboats were being boarded, attendants were ushering Ida into one of the lifeboats, but of course without her husband since women and children were being rescued first. Ida, however, refused to leave her husband, and Isidore refused to be rescued before other men. Instead, they both chose to stay on the ship, and they went down together. Ida said, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so we will die together." Survivors who witnessed their love last saw the pair standing on the deck with their arms around each other. This love story is incredibly tragic, but also just a testament to how much they loved each other. I am very glad that in those frightening moments, they at least had each other there with them. In our number 2 spot today, we have the lifeboats. Before the Titanic set sail during their preparation for the journey, at some point, people made a decision to reduce the number of lifeboats that were on board. They did this because they didn't want to clutter the deck, which is really trivial when we are talking about the safety of 2,208 passengers that were on board the ship that day. The number of lifeboats ended up being reduced to just 20, with an additional 4 that were collapsible. This meant that should they have had time to launch every single one, this would still only be enough for half of the passengers on board. That's a terrible ratio. And as we now know, during the sinking of the ship, not even all of the lifeboats were able to be launched, as everything just happened too quickly. There are quite a few lessons that can be and definitely were learned from the sinking of the Titanic, because the more we learn, the more we realize that the safety precautions taken for the ship simply just were not up to par. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Brittle Fracture. This is another one of those theories behind how the Titanic found itself at the bottom of the North Atlantic. There was an expedition down to the wreckage of the Titanic, and it revealed something very interesting about the hull of the ship. There were these large pieces of steel that were recovered, each with about 3 rivet holes 1.25 inches in diameter. These pieces revealed that the hull's iron rivets failed to brittle fracture, which is a sudden and rapid snapping. This means that there was a failure in the structural materials, and this usually happens as a result of low temperature, high impact loading, and high sulfur content, all 3 of which were present on the night of the tragedy. The water temperature was below freezing, the Titanic was traveling at a high speed on impact with the iceberg, and the hull steel contained high levels of sulfur. These chunks of metal gave researchers one of the main answers as to why the Titanic sunk that night. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I will see you again soon. Bye!